Hello all, and welcome to Meanwhile in the West, my weekly series where I look at what's making headlines here in Western Australia by reading through letters to the editor in my local newspaper, The West Australian. First up this week, Paying Our Way, 4th of March 2015. I wonder what proportion of Australia's welfare budget is taken up by would-be terrorists like Manharon Monis, who was responsible for the Lindt Cafe siege and who had not worked for 19 years while on welfare. ASIO is said to be watching up to 400 homegrown terrorists. There are people, not only terrorists, who choose not to work because they can get more money by staying at home. The more children they have, the more money they collect. If this problem were to be addressed by the Treasurer, it could make a sizable dent in the budget deficit. D. Hicks Beckenham. Yes. So now we've got linking of two perennially popular topics amongst the commentariat here at the West Australian. That is Dole Bludgers, or people on welfare, and terrorists. Brilliant. The bad news for the letter writer is that the proportion of welfare spending that could be, the amount of welfare spending that could be saved by cracking down on terrorists or people who just wantonly having children instead of getting a job is actually very, very small. So if you have a brief look at the figures, it's about 20% of Australians receive some kind of welfare from the government, apparently, and almost half of Australians pay no net taxes when you take into account how much they're getting from the government. This means that there are literally millions of people who are receiving welfare payments. On any reasonable estimate of the number of would-be terrorists, we are talking hundreds of people, at most thousands. And so of the millions of people who are welfare recipients, the proportion that would consist of would-be terrorists is some tiny percentage. Also, a would-be terrorist is a fairly broad category, which is almost impossible to catch, versus an actual terrorist or someone who is actually planning terrorist attacks. Those numbers of those people are very, very small. If ASIO is only watching, which is our security agency, is only watching 400 people, that would suggest that the numbers of people who could be actively planning terrorist attacks, doing things that essentially could be caught, and that we could kick them off welfare for if we, just had the information, would be even smaller still. So we're talking about tiny numbers of people. Also, it's not true that the guy who did the Lindt Cafe siege didn't work for 19 years. He did. He worked in a variety of positions. I think there was talk of him being a bouncer or some such. Certainly within the last 10 years he worked, because actually for a portion of time he was some kind of spiritual healer person who sexually assaulted a number of his clients. So we know that he was working. He just was a fairly evil bastard, it would seem. The other thing is that actually, in terms of budget problems, the real welfare budget problem is not actually the unemployed; it's pensioners, of which I would be very surprised if this letter writer wasn't one of those. The age pension, is actually a much it's about equal proportion with unemployment benefits. But the big problem for the budget is that the age pension is actually going to grow steadily over the next 20, 30, 40 years. And the unemployment numbers is actually not going to particularly. So the real problem for the budget is actually the aged pension. And that's where the government needs to find savings. Unemployed, particularly people who are sitting on welfare, having kids or whatever, is actually a fairly small number of people. Now, in terms of fairness, it might be reasonable to do something about those groups, but in terms of budget bottom line, it's a complete nonsense. What they really need to do to make a sizable dent in the budget bottom line, especially out across the forward estimates, is to do something about the age pension, which would be incredibly unpopular amongst the letter writers to the West Australian. Next up, more costly snails, 5th of March 2015. Plans are afoot to increase the cost of postage stamps and extend delivery dates by an extra 2 days. Slower mail stamp cost to reach $1. News, 4th of March. If, as advised, the posties continue to deliver 5 days a week, why will delivery take extra time, unless there are also plans to revert from motorbikes to foot slogging? Ron Elliott, Palmyra. The only way that this letter can even make sense to me is if they somehow think that a large portion of the time it takes to deliver a letter is that bit, is the actual the postie who is putting it in the letterbox, that somehow that is a large proportion of the amount of time it takes to deliver a letter. It seems to me that any amount of thinking on the matter would quickly disabuse you of this notion. if we think about the steps in a process, I put a letter into a letterbox. It sits there. It's collected by the post van. It's taken to some kind of local collection place. It's then sorted. It is then sent to its destination, which many letters these days are interstate. So it would need to go to the other state. It would then go down to some kind of local distribution area. It would then get sorted to whichever post person was on that particular route, and then they would take it. The actual delivery portion is at most a couple of hours in a chain that takes, several days. And most of that time is not actually in terms of the movement of the letter, but rather waiting for the next stage. So it sits and waits in the letterbox, in the post box. It then sits and waits at the sorting facility. It sits and waits for the flight. It sits and waits at the other end. That is the bits that actually take the longest time. So by extending out So what's happening is Australia Post has had a massive drop in letters. It's losing money hand over fist as a result. But thankfully it's a government utility, so it's not about to go bankrupt. But essentially it's cost their bottom line a lot, the fact that nobody's sending letters anymore. For the last several years they've been propped up by businesses sending letters, usually accounts, and lots of businesses have, over the last several years have had a huge drive to move away from paper letters, and as a result that's just completely dropped out of their business, and they now have far fewer letters coming through. The response has been to up the cost of stamps to $1, which is pretty much where it probably should be if in line with inflation. I think it's been kept artificially low. And to have a standard letter is now going to take longer to get through. So rather than it being like next day delivery or the day after, it'll be like 3-day delivery or whatever. And the reason for that is simply staff. You can achieve that throughput by having less staff, and that will save them money. As with many businesses, staff is the big cost. And so, it's not that the posties are going to be any slower, it's simply there's going to be less of them. Anyway, next up. Truth about Malcolm, 7th of March 2015. Tony Abbott has nailed the pack of journalists baying for his blood. The claim that Malcolm Turnbull, as Liberal Party leader, would gain more voter support than Abbott because Turnbull is preferred by Labor supporters is ludicrous. Let's get real. The reason Labor supporters prefer Turnbull is blindingly obvious. They believe that with Turnbull in charge, Labor would be returned to power. Bruce Harvey, Murine Rock. So, this gets it completely wrong. Labor supporters prefer Turnbull based on his policies, that is, Malcolm Turnbull's personal policies and the policies he would push as Prime Minister are more centrist than Tony Abbott. So Tony Abbott is more right than Malcolm Turnbull is. Malcolm Turnbull, though, is still a right-wing politician. He's still squarely within the Liberal Party platform. He's just slightly further to the left or slightly closer to the centre, perhaps, than Tony Abbott and some of the other factions. That's why Labor voters would tend to prefer him to Abbott. Now, whether they would prefer him to Bill Shorten is another, or whoever the Labor leader happens to be, is another question entirely. But generally speaking, Malcolm Turnbull is fairly popular as a politician. He's seen, he is now, especially in contrast to Abbott, he wasn't as popular before when he was a leader in his own right. This idea that Labor voters would prefer... The idea that Labor would prefer Turnbull because that would somehow get them back into power is completely wrong. I, as somebody who's nominally a Greens voter, but Labor in a two-party system, would certainly prefer Tony Abbott to be the leader at the next election, or somebody as right-wing as him, because he doesn't appeal to the centrists. I think as an outsider, I think Malcolm Turnbull would be much more popular amongst the centrists. Now, the reason the Liberal Party are worried about Malcolm Turnbull is not because he's unelectable by the centre of Australian politics. He is very much electable. I think he would do very good at getting the centre vote. The problem is that the Liberal Party that the Liberal Party have with Turnbull is that they worry that he would lose votes from their far right. So, when there was no far right minor parties, so between the demise of One Nation and the rise of Palmer United, there were no significant far-right parties. There was Qatar United Party, but that really only contested Queensland seats, and so it was no big deal. So for those several years, which is when Turnbull was leader, there was no far-right party. And so it was quite effective for the Liberal Party to drift to the centre to pick up the centrist votes, knowing that they couldn't lose their far-right supporters because they just simply had no other party to turn to. Now that there's the Palmer United Party, which is threatening to pick up the far-right votes, the Liberal Party is kind of stuck between trying to appeal to the centrist vote with Malcolm Turnbull, whereas trying to shore up its far-right or further right credentials with Tony Abbott. I think what's best for the Labour Party would be if they try and keep themselves to the right to fend off the Palmer United, leaving the centrist vote available for the Labour Party to pick up. All of this discussion, of course, for those of you outside of Australia, works only because of the compulsory voting. We know that the centrists have to vote. The far right have to vote. All of these people vote, and so all of their votes have to be taken into account when the parties are coming up with who's going to be their leader and what their platform are going to be. They actually have to take this stuff into account. In other systems, obviously, you can write off several of these people, particularly the centrists, as being the least likely to vote, because they're the ones with the least strongly held opinions. Here in Australia, at least, because we know that they have to vote and they will vote, there is always value in making sure that your platform has some appeal to the centrist voters. And so that stops parties like the Liberal Party from becoming too far extreme to the right. It's a bit unfortunate when the electorate itself is somewhat further to the right than I would like them to be, but, them's the breaks. Next up. Death penalty works, 9th of March 2015. T. Hudson's letter, Bullets Prove Nothing, 5th of March, trots out the usual nonsense propounded by the Anti-Capital Punishment Brigade. They recycle the same old subjective platitudes about how the death penalty has no deterrent effect. This is patently untrue and can be proved to be so. The fact that such an undignified hoo-ha has been raised by those who want the Bali 9 members to cling to life at any cost in itself proves the efficacy of the deterrent effect of capital punishment. If it didn't, why bother to be so obsessed with saving these two? Tom Edmonds, Gosnells. So still big news, the Bali 9 were 9 drug smugglers who were caught in Bali. 2 of them are due to be executed any day now in Indonesia, and there's a big dramas about it. This letter I found kind of interesting because it seems to be suggesting that because lots of people value human life regardless of the crime committed and therefore are opposed to the death penalty and are making a big deal about the impending execution of these 2 people, that somehow that proves that the death penalty is an effective deterrent to crime. The problem with this line of reasoning, I guess what I think the line of reasoning is that death penalty opponents value life greatly. Therefore, people like that, who value life greatly, would be less inclined to commit crimes if they knew that they were risking their life. Therefore, the death penalty is an effective deterrent. The problem with that is that, one, it's only about half the population here in Australia who are strongly opposed to the death penalty. So there's another half the population that aren't, and they actually tend to be much more aligned with criminals, not because it's a correlation, not causation. But the point is that a lot of criminals and stuff are not particularly swayed by thoughts of punishment. And the main reason for it is, well, there's lots of reasons for it, but one of the big reasons is because most criminals don't think they're going to get caught. Now, this is sometimes is a rationally held belief in that most crimes are not actually solved. But the perpetrators of most crimes are caught. How does that make sense? Well, overwhelmingly, a very small number of people commit the large majority of crimes. So we have very, very active offenders who do lots and lots of crimes. And these people inevitably get caught. You simply can't do as many crimes as they do and not get caught. But the thing is, they don't get punished for every single one of their crimes. Generally, they may get punished for a small subset of the number of crimes that they've committed. This leads them to feel like their odds of getting caught for any one crime is relatively low. And they'd be right. So if you're somebody like me who doesn't commit crimes, particularly, and I thought, if I rationally thought about it, I could quite easily, it was quite reasonable for me to conclude that I could get away with doing a crime. If I wanted to go and do a crime, I could go and do a burglary, and chances of me getting caught is very low, as long as I make sure that I don't leave any obvious DNA, that is blood, things like blood, basically. If there's no obvious blood and there's no obvious fingerprints, the police aren't going to go to great lengths to try and catch me for a burglary, and I'll get away with it. The thing is, one burglary doesn't generally generate much income for me, and if I got caught, that would cost me a whole lot in terms of my reputation, my standing in society, my self-image. So on a risk-reward, it's not a big deal. But the basic point is that it is still a somewhat reasonable thing to think that you're not going to get caught for the crimes. Now, these people are smuggling drugs from Indonesia. Indonesia is not the most corrupt country in the world, but it is certainly up there. It's ranked about 100 out of 170 countries in the world for corruption. That is, it's definitely below half in terms of its thing. I would expect that most drug smugglers think they've paid off the right people in order to get away with what they're doing. Most drug smugglers, in order to go through with it, almost certainly convince themselves that they're going to get away with it. And unless you can convince them that they are likely to get caught, it doesn't matter all that much how tough you make the penalty. For somebody who is convinced they're not going to get caught, the penalty isn't going to make a big difference. Now, so actually, in terms of deterring crime, one of the big things you want to do is actually make people feel like they're going to get caught, rather than make people feel like they're going to get heavy punishments. That's why a lot of the blitzes, when you look at crime blitzes, the way they work is that you catch lots of people doing things like speeding or drink driving or not wearing seatbelts or things like this. And we know that improves behaviour because people feel like they're going to get caught if they do it. The same is true for drug smuggling, the same is true for anything else. And we know the evidence that the death penalty is an effective deterrent is poor at best. So we know across the board, if we know about all crimes and all punishments, we know that there is a very rapidly diminishing returns. So most of your reduction in crime comes from simply labelling a behaviour criminal. So as soon as you criminalise something, we know that you get massive reductions in the amount of people actually doing it. So when beating your wife became domestic, when sort of some marital chastisement became domestic violence and became an offence, we know that rates of beating your wife actually went down, simply labelling it like that. Because people don't want to most people don't want to commit crimes, and if they find out that what they were doing or what they might want to do is actually a crime, most people will abstain from it without any threat of punishment. From there, as we ramp up the punishments from simply appearing in court, so dragging somebody into court and convicting them, even if you give them no other penalty, is actually an effective deterrent for a lot of the rest of people. Most of us don't like having to go to court. We don't like being convicted of things. It ruins our sense of self-worth, at least somewhat, and it lowers our standing in the community. So for most people, most of the rest of the people, simply taking them to court and convicting them is a sufficient deterrent. And then as you increase your punishments more and more, you're getting a smaller and smaller slice of those people who are left, until eventually there are some people who it seems that no amount of deterrent would actually stop them. And that's what we're talking about when you're talking about the death penalty. The difference between life imprisonment here we're talking about Indonesia. So Indonesian jails are not the same as Western jails or Australian jails. So the difference in perceived suffering of somebody who is going to have life imprisonment in Indonesia versus death is not a whole lot. The deterrent effect, if there is any, is very small. And when we look at studies out of the US, because the US is interesting in that much more so than many other countries, there's a lot of variation between states, and that allows us to look at similar states that are similar in many demographic ways, but where one happens to have the death penalty and the other one doesn't, and compare them to look at deterrent effect. And basically, there is no clear evidence that it works. Something like 88% of, when surveyed, about 88% of criminologists, so people, experts in the field, agree that there is no deterrent effect, which means that there's about 12% who think that there might be, or they don't know. So overwhelmingly, there is no good deterrent effect that comes from the death penalty. And even if there was, it would have to be small, because we're talking about because we know that life imprisonment is such a high deterrent for everybody else. We're talking about a very small number of people who would not be deterred by that, but would be deterred by the threat of death. So even if there was a small deterrent effect, and it would have to be small, that's not outweighed by all of the other problems that come with death penalty. It's far more expensive. It's prone to errors in a way that is far worse than erroneously locking people up. And it is just as racist and classist and sexist, for that matter, as every other part of the judicial system. So there you go. There's my mini rant on why the death penalty sucks. Lastly this week, let off lightly, 10th of March 2015. I shudder to think how the woman sexually assaulted by a porn-addicted 15-year-old playing out his fantasies must feel at his inadequate sentence. A 10-month conditional release order and 80 hours of community service. Boy hid porn habit before sex assault. News 6th of March. Being from a deeply religious family should have no sway in sentencing this vile act. The perpetrator deserves full force of the law to quell his addiction. Stephen White, Stoneville. This was an interesting case, well, interesting to me, that was recently in the news because the boy was recently sentenced. Essentially what happened is we have a 15-year-old boy from a deeply religious family who sexually assaulted a woman. So the sexual assault he was convicted of, he touched her breast, and then I believe he put his hand up her skirt, and he was charged with some kind of penetrative type offence. So it was a significant hand up the skirt. As a result of this, I believe he pled guilty. There was no suggestion that he didn't, and he was given a 10-month conditional release order and 80 hours of community service. The conditional release order basically means that as long as he has restrictions on what he can do, it's sort of like being on parole, essentially. And as long as for the next 10 months, he follows the conditions and he doesn't commit any further offences, he won't have to go. He won't go into detention. If he does breach it in some way, then he could possibly end up in detention. And this was, as the letter suggests, seen as being a real light let-off. Basically, first offence, 15-year-old. We're looking at basically it's probably about the right thing. I can't see any reason for immediate detention. Detention of children is generally seen as, well, children in particular, the focus is supposed to be on rehabilitation. So the 80 hours of community service is supposed to be rehabilitative in this sense. So it's not just, well, it probably might be, but it's not supposed to be just picking up rubbish, but it's supposed to be something that's going to be helpful to him in terms of addressing it. And 10-month conditional release seems like a reasonable thing as well. If the boy is a bad sort and is going to continue doing the wrong thing, then they'll lock him up. If he is not such a bad sort and it was a one-off thing, then, there's no reason for locking him up. This doesn't do anybody any good. The interesting thing to me, though, was that it was made clear during the trial, and the judge accepted it during the I think it was just sentencing, because I think he pled guilty, but it was made clear during the sentencing, and the judge seemed to accept it, that one of the main driving forces in this was a porn addiction, but part of the reason why he had this porn habit was because he came from a deeply religious family that refused to do any kind of sex ed with the boy. So essentially, this boy had no information on sexuality at all, and had reached puberty and started having all these sexual urges, and had no idea what to do with any of it, particularly because he'd been raised in this deeply, strictly religious, Christian upbringing that basically said sexuality is sinful. As a result, he developed this secret porn habit that nobody knew about, which then seemed to have blossomed into this assault on a woman. And the interesting thing, part of what I found interesting, was that the paper didn't hold back from reporting him that sort of religious aspect of it. It was clear that the religion he was raised in was harmful to him. That wasn't the only reason why he would have committed this offence, but it seemed to be that, the judge and the prosecutor and the defence seemed to accept that it was a driving factor in that. And I thought that was interesting because people often say, what harm does religion do? And here we have a religion, this is not, we deny medical care to our children type religion. This is a religion that is stricter than the average Christian here, but is probably not that far outside of what most people would consider, acceptable religion, just more strict, which seems to have had actually quite a significant harm on this boy, and then this boy's victim as a result. That had this child had some just reasonable sex education about, what is normal for a teenager to feel and, and express and that kind of thing, could well have not led to this woman being sexually assaulted. The other thing but when The assault happened near a train station in an afternoon. I don't think it was late night or anything like that. And after it seemed like the initial shock of being assaulted, the woman's response to it when he put his hand up his skirt was, "What the fuck do you think you're doing? Fuck off." Which I thought was a perfectly appropriate response to somebody who was trying to sexually assault you. And slightly Australian, perhaps. Anyway, there you go. So, turns out, fairly strict religious upbringing not only can be emotionally damaging, but can lead you to, can be a contributing factor in sexually assaulting people. So if you want to add that to your list of reasons not to be a strict Christian. That's it for me for this week. I hope you're all doing well. I'm doing well, apart from my fairly spotty internet connection. And I hope you join me next week when we find out what's happening in the West. See ya.